Hello, everybody, and a warm welcome to another IISS Japan Chair Programme webinar. I'm Robert Ward, the IISS Japan Chair and Director of Geo-Economics and Strategy at the IISS. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. The topic of today's discussion is critical minerals and green industries in the Indo Pacific. In view of yesterday's tariff announcements by President Trump at the White House, the timing of this session could not be better, although fortuitously so, given that we planned this webinar before we knew that the announcements would be made. But I'm sure that we'll be touching on some of the President's comments in today's discussion. Critical minerals and green tech are, of course, squarely in the crosshairs of geopolitical competition. Chinese control of the supply of critical minerals and its dominance of green industries have raised concerns about the security of global supply chains in Europe, Japan, and the US. As an example of its dominant position, China not only supplies the majority of critical minerals for electric vehicles or EV batteries, but it also refines the larger part of these minerals and materials in the global supply chain. Given the importance of the automotive industry to Japan, the US, and Europe, China's EV leverage has significant strategic, economic, and national security implications. Critical minerals are also increasingly feature in Sino-US trade friction. In December last year, China restricted exports of gallium, germanium, and antimony to the US. China cited national security concerns as a reason for the move, but this also came in response to US tech restrictions against China. Once again, Japan and the EU, UK find themselves in the middle of this friction. In this webinar, we have three very distinguished experts from both Japan and the US to discuss the strategic dynamics of critical minerals and green industries in the Indo-Pacific region. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to explain the logistics of today's session, give you some housekeeping rules. After I've introduced the speakers, each panelist will speak for about 7 minutes. The speakers and I will then begin a roughly 15 to 20-minute conversation, which will be followed by a 20-minute Q&A session. We'll be using Zoom's Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screens, as you can see there on the screen, and you're very welcome to type your questions in at any time. But please, when you're asking your questions, please state your affiliation and your name. This is a big help to our speakers so we know where you're coming from. And this webinar will last about an hour. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's wonderful panelists in the order in which they will speak. Our first speaker is Amano Tatsushi, who is Managing Executive Officer and the Global Head of the Energy and National Resources Finance Group at the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, or JBIC, which, as many of you will know, is a policy-based Japanese financing institution owned by the government of Japan. Since joining JBIC in 1995, Tatsushi has worked in a variety of roles at the bank, including in the legal department, corporate finance, policy planning, and new energy and power finance. He was also seconded to the Japanese Ministry of Finance from 1999 to 2001, admitted to the New York State Bar in 2002, and practiced law in London from 2012 to 2014. Tatsushi's family has an interest in architecture, and in our preparation call for this session, he reminded me of the superb architecture on display at the Osaka Expo, which of course is about to open. Welcome, Tatsushi. And our second speaker is Dr. Kristin Vekasi. She is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and School of Policy and International Affairs at the University of Maine. Kristin specializes in trade and investment strategies in changing geopolitical environments and the political risk management of supply chains. Her book, called Risk Management Strategies of Japanese Companies in China, which was published by Routledge in 2019, explores how Japanese multinational companies mitigate political risk in China. Kristin's current research examines how Japan, China, and the US cooperate and compete to manage complex supply chains, focusing on raw materials and industries essential for the transition to green energy. Kristin is also a fan of the national parks in the US and loves to spend time in the mountains, which I'm assuming is one of the reasons, Kristin, for your interest in critical minerals. And Kristin keeps pet snakes. So welcome, Kristin. And our third speaker is Dr. Suzuki Hitoshi, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Geo-Economics, the IOG in Tokyo. Previously, Hitoshi was Associate Professor at the Graduate School of International Studies and Regional Development at the University of Niigata Prefecture in Japan. His research is focused on Japan's relations with the EC, EU, as well as Japan's auto and aerospace industry in Europe. He is the author of several books, including Japanese Investment and British Trade Unionism, Thatcher and Nissan Revisited in the Wake of Brexit, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2020. And he's also written a book, A Global History of the Automotive Sector, which I think is only available in Japanese at the moment. Hitoshi also has a private interest in cars and motorcycles, as well as the Moomin family, which, as many of you will know, is hugely popular in Japan. Although, as he reminded me in a previous conversation, there are no cars in Moomin. So, welcome, Hitoshi. So thank you, everybody, audience as well, for joining us today. I'll now open up the floor to presentations from our speakers. And in order of the introduction, over to you, Tatsushi, please.
Thank you very much, Robert-san. It is my great pleasure to join this event. Today, I would like to discuss the issues around the financing to the critical minerals. As Robert-san has already pointed out, there is a significant attention that paid to the critical minerals from the policy perspectives. But I'd like to introduce some of the changes occurring in the area of financing. To begin with, mining projects require long-term, large-scale financing, which often determines the success and the failures of the project. While some mining minerals, such as copper, are relatively abundant worldwide, others, such as cobalt, are unevenly distributed geographically, and majority of the world's the cobalt reserves located in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This uneven distribution exposes these minerals to political risks. Against this backdrop, public financial institutions have traditionally played a major role in financing mining projects. However, their involvement has not been straightforward. In the 1990s, international organizations such as the World Bank were not very interested in the mining sector. Mining projects are essential for the economic growth of the host countries, but they also have a significant environmental impact. In addition, in poor countries, it was not uncommon for corrupt practices to be involved. But in recent years, multilateral development banks, MDBs, have returned back to mining sector. In 2023, the World Bank launched a new initiative called RISE, R-I-S-E, supported by Japan's Ministry of Finance. This initiative is to support the capacity building and institutional reform in developing countries' mining sector. One of its objectives is to diversify the processing industry, which is currently dominated by China. Likewise, export credit agencies has also played a major role in the mining sector. Traditionally, they provided the finance based upon the export of equipments, which means the financing is unavailable if no export is involved. Additionally, mining projects often require massive local costs, which are not financeable under conventional export credit facilities. However, the situation has significantly changed in recent years. Previously, only a limited number of public financial institutions provided the finance based upon imports of raw materials. JBIC and the German KfW IPEX Bank were one of them. But now, many other export credit agencies are following suits. In 2022, the Swedish institution EKN started off offtake financing, and 2023, the Italian institution SACE provided the finance to the commodity trader Trafigura, even though the transaction was not linked to exports from Italy. In the UK, last year, UKEF launched a new program called Critical Minerals Supply Finance, financing based upon offtake of critical minerals. Finally, the Export-Import Bank of the United States recently launched a program called Supply Chain Resiliency Initiative, a financing program for mining projects in which the Japanese companies, the US companies enter into long-term offtake agreements. Now, many public financial institutions in various countries can provide finance to mining projects, regardless of the export of equipment. In parallel, a cooperation mechanism between countries have also emerged. In 2022, the United States led the cooperation framework called Mineral Security Partnership, MSP. And since last year, the public financial institutions joined the regular conversation we call the finance meetings to exchange information on individual projects. However, there are problems that cannot be solved through finance. The critical minerals are often developed by junior miners, small mining companies, but it is quite difficult for financial institutions to take the risk of such finance small mining companies. Unfortunately, JBIC has not yet been able to fully address this issue. However, the Australian Public Financial Institution, EFA, has already provided the finance to the junior mine projects. We would like to learn more from their experiences and consider what we can do to respond to these challenges. Another problem is a concentration of the processing industry. To begin with, the many critical minerals are byproduct of other materials. Therefore, the critical mineral strategy should focus not only on upstream development project, but also the processing industry. But unfortunately, the current level of the processing margin is not attractive enough for many investors. So it is not very easy to compete with China, which has already large-scale, very competitive facilities. This seems to be a problem for the industry as a whole. Therefore, if the stable supply of the critical minerals is important, it would be necessary for the entire supply chain from upstream to downstream supports the processing industry. That's my observation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those comments, and interesting your final comment there, Tatsushi, on the problems with the processing industry. So perhaps we'll come back to that in a bit. So over to you, Kristin, for your comments, please.
Hi, good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. It's morning here, so you'll see me drinking my morning tea. Thanks so much for having me here today. So I thought in my opening remarks, I'm going to step back a little bit and give us a little taste of the broader geopolitical scene surrounding critical minerals, and think about this problem of securitization and how that fits into the economics and approach of how we'll think about critical minerals. So right now we're seeing critical mineral policies and securitization arise around the world, not just in the Indo Pacific or the countries we've talked about, but also more broadly. And there are a couple of reasons for this. And one reason we've already heard about very clearly in the introduction and also from Amano-san, that we have choke points, right? And some of these are geographic choke points, like we see, let's say, cobalt in the DRC, but these are relatively rare. Often the choke points are more created by policy. Right? So there's economic policy, trade restrictions, industrial policy, technology policy and development, complex supply chains, things that create these choke points that are possible to resolve through diversification, resilience policies, financing, as we've heard, and other approaches. So these are solvable choke points, but indeed they are choke points nonetheless. In part, in response to these choke points, starting in more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but really taking off about in 2020, we started to see critical mineral policies around the world. So I'll just share a couple of slides. This is data collected by me and a research team. And this is looking at cumulative critical mineral policies by year. And what these are specific policies by countries that have defined critical minerals as necessary for national security and for some specific foreign policy or strategic security use. So these are not necessarily mining policies, although those occasionally are the same, but these are actually formal securitization of critical minerals, and they also have a specific list of minerals included in the policy. So there are currently at least 35. We may have missed one or two in the last few months, but at least 35 of these policies. And you can see that really after 2020, they start to take off. There's a lot of agreement around the world about what sorts of minerals should be on these lists. So looking at this, top 75% of these lists have cobalt, rare earths, niobium, lithium on them. We see other minerals, vanadium, nickel, I'll talk about a little bit, tungsten, graphite, things that we're using in the supply chains for these green technologies and also the digital transformation are broadly agreed upon by countries that are securitizing critical minerals as the minerals that we should be focusing on. That said, there were 85 different minerals that broadly showed up on these lists. So there's not complete agreement, but there's broad securitization. These are also happening all around the world. So looking at the map of where we saw critical minerals, these are on most continents. The EU also has a critical mineral policy, although some countries in the EU also have their own specific policies, which is reflected on this map. So they're globally distributed. They're distributed among countries that are largely consuming critical minerals or their end products, as well as countries that are producing and mining and processing the critical minerals. And one of the things our research showed is that being a consumer country or a producer country were the key indicators of whether a country would adopt one of these or not. But another indicator was a long history of state intervention in the economy. And so countries that were more likely to adopt a critical mineral policies were also the countries that were more likely to, say, use industrial policy, resource nationalism style policies, et cetera. And this, I think, really matters when we think about how we should respond to our current issues with critical mineral supply chains and politics. So I think one interesting way to look at this in the Indo Pacific is thinking about two cases that both do have critical mineral policies, which are Japan and Indonesia. And Japan, as we've already heard about, has been approaching diversification, issues of economic security with critical minerals through industrial policy, through financing, through public-private partnerships. Japan is relatively resource scarce, at least in terms of resources that are available in the short and medium term to access. There may be resources in the longer term with new technology and approaches that are available, but at this moment of transition, Japan is resource scarce. Japan is relatively good at industrial policy, has a history of that, has some capacity, tools, experience to do that, and has had success relative to other countries with diversification, particularly thinking about rare earths, where Japan has been actively working on diversification much more than other countries. Indonesia is also in the region, is a global supplier of nickel with a very strong history of resource nationalism, particularly national control of its natural resources. Under Indonesia's current critical mineral policy, there has been heavy use of export restrictions and trade policy in order to internalize the processing, both mining and processing, smelting of nickel, and in order to encourage foreign investment, which to some extent has been very successful. However, their critical mineral policy list contains 52 minerals, which are almost mineral for mineral exactly the same as the minerals that are on the United States list. And there is an eye within that policy to try to bring up Indonesia's place in the critical mineral supply chain in order to bring that critical mineral wealth to the country of Indonesia, perhaps the government of Indonesia as well. So this is very much a reaction to global trends and to global securitization. So thinking about this, one of the things we really need to think about carefully with things like financing, with thinking about diversification, resilience, national security needs of consumer countries, is that producer countries like Indonesia are dynamically responding with their own policies. And this isn't a static situation where rich countries make policies and then producer and perhaps mining and processing countries respond. It's possible that next steps might look like mini or multilateral partnerships like the Mineral Security Partnership, perhaps some of these smaller partnerships via the Quad or bilateral approaches. But I think that we need to be very cautious about that because, again, there's response from producer countries. This is a dynamic game, and it's one that can be very costly for the communities in which the mining and processing occurs. And lastly, I'll just end with two cautions. First is that policies need to depend on one's goal. So if the goal is for a rapid green transition, then what we need to do is cooperate deeply with China, because that is where the expertise and the resource wealth in the supply chains lies. And in our current moment, and particularly from the last 12 hours, that seems increasingly unlikely, at least from where I am sitting in the United States. I think it was unlikely previous, but now it's even more unlikely. But that is a quicker approach towards a green transition. But if the goal is more national autonomy, independence, secure and resilient supply chains outside of that geopolitical line, then that indicates rapidly and quickly diversifying away from China, even though that is going to introduce far more inefficiencies and greater costs. So that is the trade-off, and it will probably lead to a slower transition. But we need to be very clear that is the cost of taking that approach. So right now we stand at an edge of a very sharp turn towards isolationism in the United States and a very likely global trade war. Maybe the United States versus the rest. We will see what happens. And I think some of our base assumptions about how the global economy functions and how we're going to do this may need to be reconsidered. But as we do, well, we can take the status quo into account. I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristin. I was struck by your point about choke points being created by policy, and that's worth always noting. And your chart, which had cumulative critical materials policies by year, that was also very striking, particularly given the rise recently. And your point on producer countries having agency, I think you were saying as well, which is also important to note. And the point about policy goals, which, as you say, I think is not quite clear at the moment. But thank you for that. And our last speaker, please, Hitoshi, over to you.
Oh, yes, thanks so much, Robert. So, yes, after listening to distinguished two speakers, I would like to a bit more focus down to specifically cars and think about the critical minerals and ecology, so to say, decarbonization efforts. First, I want to say that the lithium-ion batteries also used in personal computers or handy phones, these use precious sort of critical minerals, like we've already heard lithium or cobalt, nickel, Kristin just mentioned, and Amano-san also, Tatsushi also mentioned. So these are used in almost any hybrid car or battery EV or plug-in hybrid cars because it's the lithium-ion battery. And it's merely a difference of size and also the structure of putting it together might be different, but the basic sort of structure are the same lithium-ion battery, which means that like if you take one plug-in hybrid car's battery, that is nearly 10 vehicles of hybrid car batteries put together if we count that as an electronic output. So if it's battery EV, it's like 40% to 80 times more power output, electric power output than a hybrid. So battery EVs are using a very sort of considerably large amount of that precious sort of resource. So I would like to keep away whether hybrids or battery EVs, which are so much ecological. I think these are merely two different paths, and both are going towards decarbonization. I think that would be my argument. So it's good to have a huge battery and sort of giving out no emissions when you're running. But still, that means precious sort of minerals would have to be intensely used for only producing one car. That would be my point. So I think, yeah, so the battery EVs, unfortunately, is facing a sort of sales slump, not just in Europe, but it has not sold well in Japan. And also in the United States, it's now a hybrid car boom. So I'm not sure if this is the right path if we're talking about decarbonization, because I do think that in the far future, battery EVs are sort of rational choice, so to say, because it has less moving parts. If the battery technology advances, it will make a lot more sense than now. And if the price of battery EVs goes down, I would even afford and get rid of my hybrid and try a battery EV. It's only that it's too much expensive for a family household. And I think this is something common, not only in consumers in Japan, but also in Europe and elsewhere. So the EV sort of slump of sales, this is caused by the end of subsidies, the purchasing subsidies, not just in Europe, but elsewhere, and also in the United States as well. And the reason EU and the EU member states have sort of put to the ending this subsidy was that the market has changed and that EVs are already more flourishing. So purchasing subsidies are not necessary anymore. I think that also, if we are sort of understanding the market in that way, I think the CO2 emission penalty sort of caused on the car makers, I think that scheme also needs a reconsideration if we understand that the market is already in a different stage. It's because those penalties were sort of introduced as policies when the car makers were least interested in developing battery EVs. Now, any car maker do have in their lineup some sort of battery EV or plug-in hybrids. So I think it doesn't sound reasonable to penalize the car makers and then giving the penalty fees all over to a battery EV maker who's successful, because it's the companies which are not successful yet in the battery EVs which need a lot more budget to well develop their batteries. That's one point. And the other point is, where do we need to put all that money to is charging points. It's because there are not enough charging points elsewhere looking around, and we have to develop a lot more of that if we want to see more battery EVs sold on the market. So that would be another point which I would sort of point out. And I think the slump of the battery EVs is, in a sense, ironical that, well, our dependency on China is going to slow down as well if battery EVs don't sell. So that's sort of economic security sort of point of view. But I think I would like to point out, just because an anonymous industry person has told me, how much would it actually cost to sort of de-risk China or decouple China when sourcing materials for the cars? And the estimated cost for one car, like aluminum, if you stop sourcing that from China and source that from sort of like-minded countries, it would cost like 5,000 yen per car, which means that is like $33 for a car, 31 euro or 26 UK pounds. So that's aluminum, and that's not cheap. But nickel, it costs like 5 times more, cobalt 12 times more, lithium probably 28 times more. So if we calculate that, the price difference for a car, if we try to source that other than China, is going to cost like 230,000 yen per unit. And in different currencies, that's going to be like 1,520 US dollars, 1,425 euros, and 1,200 UK pounds. So that is quite a price difference. It's a very rough calculation because that's only one source, and that was a very rough calculation. But still, I think we do have to think, so who's going to shoulder that extra cost? Because if that's the price difference, that's more than the discount rate which will be proposed at a dealership, a car dealership. So how do we actually shoulder that? And I think so the sort of emission sort of reducing penalties, if money is going to somewhere, I think that should be, for example, used to diversify such mineral sources. And as I just said, or alternatively, to sort of more expand the battery charging points, which are very scarce. So those would be my points. And finally, about Donald Trump and the tariffs. Well, yes, I think there would be a lot of criticism why Japanese would only buy Japanese cars in Japan. I think the simplest argument back against that is that the American cars, in average, are too much big and heavy in very narrow Japanese streets. So European cars sell a lot well now in Japan, and there are hybrids available. So I would try to say that if you want to sell cars, it has to be the right models, because the Tesla Model 3, which is the smallest Tesla, is still almost the largest car category in Japan. It has to be a lot more lightweighted and smaller. So the so-called Model 2, which is now becoming a robotaxi, that barely fits the Japanese narrow streets. So I would wish for Model 2 and a robotaxi, so to say. And of course, Japan has no car import tariffs. So I would be happy to try such models. And yeah, I think I'll just stop right there. Thanks.
Thank you, Hitoshi. Your point about the matching the cars to the needs of the Japanese market, I think is absolutely right. And also there's the issue of demographic change in Japan as well, the need to have cars you can get wheelchairs in and out of and so on. So perhaps if any of our US car company friends are listening, they can take some advice from this webinar. I was struck again by your comment on the resource intensity of EV batteries and the cost of de-risking from China, 230,000 yen per car. That is steep, particularly given other cost of living pressures. So just a quick, we got some questions that are starting to come in. So to our audience, I'm going to now just ask a few questions of my own. But do feel free to put your questions into the chat, and we'll get to you in about a quarter of an hour. A question first to Tatsushi, if I may. You talked about the issues with the processing industries, and you were talking about linking upstream and downstream operations as a sort of way of doing this. What specifically would you like to see happen to help to solve this problem with critical minerals?
Yes, thank you very much for asking this question. It is very difficult, the top questions. Nowadays, you know, there is a tendency in the processing industry, always the scale, economy of scale is quite important. The bigger, the better. That's the reason why China is dominating the processing market. And of course, you know, the environmental issue might be one of their the advantage, but at the same time, basically, I believe that they have advanced the facility and also the large scale the processing facility. That's their advantage. And if you think about the structure of the supply chain of the mining sector, you know, maybe the rate of the return with respect to the processing industry, it will be the lower for the upstream investors. That's the reason why, you know, the upstream investors are not very interested in the working in the processing industry. But if they want to diversify their the ultimate the client, which means that, you know, in many cases that they are selling their products to China, and but they also have the supplier, the producers has also an interest of diversifying their clients, and therefore and also probably in my view the deepest pocket is always the upstream developers. Therefore that's the reason why you know, the kind of the vertical integration, which means upstream and the processing industry that will be the natural choice for diversifying the processing aspect, and ultimately but still, it requires a certain level of the technical assistance. With respect to the Kristin's the example of the Indonesia, the ones that Japanese company tries to make an investment in the nickel, the processing, the business in Indonesia, but they failed to do that because of the profitability of this question. And in the previously, we had the thought that the Indonesia would be able to produce only a very low grade the nickels, but it turned out to not be the case. They are successful in producing high grade, the battery grade, the nickels. So we underestimated the Indonesia and the Chinese the investment, and but in Indonesia, the upstream producer are now successful in the processing industry.
Thank you, Tatsushi. I can see, Kristin, I can see you nodding there with Indonesia. Do you want to come in?
Well, I think I just jump in to say, I mean, I think these are really, really great points. And one of the really interesting cases with Indonesia and processing that I think shows some of the political complexities is one of the Japanese projects that was under a consideration for a long time, and then the Japanese firm did end up withdrawing from the project because the due diligence reasons, and then that project ended up going into a joint venture between a Chinese company and an American company. And so it's like that story of cooperation doesn't fit with the geopolitical story that we can broadly tell, but that is more of the reality of what is happening on the ground with these complex, often very international, very complex joint ventures and supply chains.
So do you just, if I could stick with you for a second, Kristin, obviously yesterday's announcement of tariffs by President Trump, significant in so many ways. You're talking about cooperation there, but the bigger picture seems to be one of tension between the US and China. How do you think, I mean, do you think that we're now in a new era for the impact of Sino-US tensions on supply chains, critical minerals, or is this sort of continuation of what we've had before? How do you view where we're going with this?
That's a great question. I think in terms of US-China cooperation specifically, this fits the trend that we have been seeing, and it is an acceleration of the trend, but it is in line with what we've been seeing certainly since 2017 in the first Trump administration, and perhaps even a few roots before that. But we've just gone up a little bit exponentially. But I think a difference, and we see that from the United States side, but we're also seeing some of the tools that China refrained from using in the last years now coming to the fore and thinking about critical minerals, right? We do see, we saw in December during the Biden administration, late Biden administration, more restrictions. We saw the germanium and gallium restrictions earlier than that. And certainly I anticipate more critical mineral restrictions on the United States in the coming months, although who am I to make predictions? That said, in the announcement yesterday, certain critical minerals that are not available in the United States were exempted from the tariffs. So there's an acknowledgement, although it's unclear what those minerals will be and how that list will be decided. We're very unclear. So I think in terms of US-China relations, we're in continuity, but with respect to US relations, global trade relations, and the United States' role in the global trading system more broadly, that is where we're seeing a dramatic change. And so that is where I think some of our past patterns are going to be, it's going to be more difficult for us to predict the next few years based on the post-Bretton Woods era, and perhaps we should be looking to different eras for lessons.
Yeah, interesting. Hitoshi, if I could bring you in on EVs. Within Asia, Southeast Asia, for example, Indonesia, Thailand, they also are trying to get bits of the EV supply chain. But you talked about China's dominance in EVs. How do you think China's EV dominance will play out to transform the geopolitical, geo-economic landscape in the Indo Pacific?
Yes, thanks so much. This is very difficult because I'm not a car salesman and could not sort of forecast how much Chinese EV is going to sell well. And in fact, they are starting to sell well, like in Thailand. In Thailand, it also has always been a Japanese car industry's sort of supply chain, and so many factories, car makers, and component suppliers have factories there. But the Chinese EVs are coming there. I mean, the Chinese domestic market is sort of flooded with their own cars. So they started to focus on exporting. And I think we might want to sort of remember that China is a sort of unexceptional sort of an extraordinary, sorry, sort of car giant, because any car making country was always successful in exports and launching local factories globally. But China just risen and overtook Japan and the United States in car manufacturing without any exports until 2009 or something. And then it starts exporting 10 years, decades later. So it's sort of an unusual sort of rise as a car manufacturing giant. And how is this going to change the landscape in Southeast Asia? I think I'll try to say that, like the global South and how they sort of choose between China and the United States, this is a Japanese company's sort of answer in the Economic Security 100 survey, 100 firm survey, that they don't want to be asked to choose between the United States and China. And I assume that any Southern Eastern Asian countries would also respond that the worstest question to ask is to choose between China and the United States, because you want to do good business with both. But that's specifically what we were asked now. So we'll have to deal with that. And yeah, just like the Toyota chairperson, Toyoda-san, just said that this is a once in a century sort of changing era. And I think that is right. And also in terms of the car industry structure, because I think it was like in 2020, Japanese car makers was talking about, so we need a China supply chain and the rest, the global supply chain, that you have to separate those two. Now we have to separate a China supply chain, United States supply chain, and the rest global supply chain. And that is quite a sort of a geopolitical change, I would say, which I think we haven't seen in the long history of cars. So I think that would be, yeah, my take. Thanks.
Thank you, Hitoshi, and that also relates to other products as well, I suspect, not just cars now. Thank you for those replies. We've got some fantastic questions coming in now, so I'm going to go to questions, and everyone's been very good at putting their names and affiliations in, so thank you for that. I've got a question from Elizabeth Press from the UN, and she's given two questions. I'm going to focus on one, given the time constraints, and that is the panel's views on the impact of increased defence spending in Europe, in particular on critical minerals, both in terms of financing of new projects and competition with energy transitions. Do any of you obviously want to take that, or shall I just pick somebody? Hitoshi, I think you were nodding there, so I'm going to pick you.
Well, actually, the reason was that, yeah, the defense expenditure, it's not going to be about the rare earth thing. I think I would like to point out that rare earth is not really rare. It's everywhere. It's only a question that who digs for it and who refines it. And that is the point where China just grasped the choking point, because they were, good at sort of a low cost in processing. And so it is available sort of anywhere around on Earth. So it's a question who refines it. and effective in it. So coming back to the European defense expenditure expand, I think this could be seen as a chance for European car makers because they have to reduce their investments in battery EVs. But then the factory could be sold to the defense industry. So on one point, like the German car makers are going through a serious reconstruction. But then, well, if it's necessary in somewhere else, if someone else wants that factory, that's not really a bad news for the economy as a whole. But then when it comes to like government subsidy and financing, of course, resource would have to go to the weapon industry, which means less budget for rare earth materials. I think that would be my take.
Thank you, Hitoshi. Tatsushi, do you want to take the question as well?
Yes, thank you very much. In my view, probably the defense industry's requirement for the critical minerals is relatively small as opposed to the requirement in the general use. Therefore, that's the reason why, you know, if you look at the U.S. defense industry, they have very broad and they are quite established, but still they do not have the critical minerals, the processing industry in the defense industry, which means that nobody paid great attention to the critical the minerals, the upstream development and the processing aspect as a part of the defense industry. And that's probably the reality. But at the same time, you know, if the critical minerals is often exposed to the risks of the price fluctuation and the demand fluctuation, and if the government is able to demonstrate certain stable the demand for the critical minerals, it would have an impact of stabilizing the price of some certain the critical minerals, and it will give a great comfort for the upstream and the processing industry.
Thank you, Tatsushi. Kristin, did you want to make any comments on this particular question? Okay. So let's go to, we've got two questions on India, which I think India's role in this sort of new world we're living in is going to be important. So we got, I'll read them both. One from Nihal Mishra, who's visiting associate fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies in India. And Nihal's question is, India is part of both the Quad and the Mineral Security Partnership, reflecting its growing commitment to securing and diversifying critical mineral supply chains. From your perspectives, how do you see India's role evolving in these frameworks, especially in terms of contributing to rare earth value chains and collaborating with partners like the US and Japan on tech investment and sustainable sourcing in the Indo Pacific? And then also on India, we have a question from Alessandro Gagaridis, who is with the research fellow from the Center for Security and Defense Studies of the Belgian Ministry of Defense. And Alessandro's question is, what role can India play in critical minerals supply chain diversification, and how much do you think it can have an impact at the geostrategic level? So two questions on the very important role of India in this. And Kristin, I can see you nodding there. Do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll jump in, then I'm sure some of the other panelists will have some great specifics. But it's I think as an academic, I'll say it's important to think a little bit historically that India used to be the world's, specifically with the rare earth elements, the global powerhouse, and lost that role as the almost primary supplier of rare earths when it placed trade restrictions on export restrictions on its rare earths, and the United States started building up its rare earth industry in the 1950s. And so now we're coming back around again to a very similar era. So we've gone through these transitions before. So India certainly has a really big potential to do that. India was one of the early partners for Japan in its rare earth diversification efforts. And there are a number of interesting joint ventures, both in mining and processing, that are going on with Japan and India. And I imagine that Amano-san actually can speak to those more specifically. So maybe I'll turn it over turn it over to you.
Tatsushi, a cue for you then.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, you are flattering. And however, yeah, I'm monitoring the Japanese companies' activities all over the world in the mining sector. But to be honest with you, the Japanese the companies are not so active in the mining sector in India at this moment. Yes, when we had the conversation with the Japanese companies, they are more focused upon the developed countries like the Chile and Australia and probably the India looks to them not so high priority the region, unfortunately.
Thank you. Hitoshi, did you want to come in on that one?
Yes, thanks so much. Probably it's too much about cars, but anyways, it's so important. So yeah, in terms of car and supply chains, of course, it would make very much sense if India is also sourcing some rare earth materials, because in terms of car market, India has more population than China nowadays. So it would be so much makes sense that you source the materials there and then assemble cars there, because that would be good. And the materials could be sourced to anywhere else in the Indo Pacific. So it would make very much sense. But then that being said, what the Japanese companies do answer as some concerns doing business in India, not only car industry, but others as well, is the question of infrastructure. And there are good infrastructure in India, like in very specific zones. But then the rest would be like road infrastructure, water, electricity. These have to be improved, so to say. And so the Japanese companies would worry about the infrastructure and also human resources and the total cost. If you close down a factory in China and try to move it to India, that would cost sort of extra. And do they actually have access to good human resources? Of course, they are very good human resources, but then all the rivals will have to grab the best, brightest. So there's also competition there. So a very bright prospect for India. There's lots of roles to be played by India and some difficulties which have to be overcome. I think that would be my point. Thanks.
I'll just jump in really quickly one more time that in 2010, 11, 12, and this very early push by Japanese government and also Japanese companies to diversify, there were many of the projects, most of the projects that Japan initially tried did not result in new supply chains, and including most of the projects that were in India, also most of the projects in Vietnam, in Kazakhstan, also in North America, and that's the normal process, that most of these initial projects do not work out, and the time horizon for starting an initial project and having a new functioning supply chain is often decades. And so that's the time frame that we do need to think about. So when we say, oh, look, there's these new critical mineral policies and there's a rise in 2020, we shouldn't expect to see a result by 2025 necessarily, and it will take longer than that. But many of the companies, like some of the ones that I'm tracking in India, they're a small number, and they are small companies, but they are still there. And so right, we can continue, I think, to look at the development of that, even though the ones that really have worked are with places that have great capacity as well as great natural resources, like Australia, right? That is really where, that's the real success story in terms of international cooperation and diversification.
Thank you, Kristin. I'm going to try and be a good chair and finish as nearly on the dot as of the hour, just to reassure the audience. But I've got three questions I want to get to. I've got one from Chris Clegg, who is Associate Fellow on the IISS Geo-Economics and Strategy Programme. And his question is, how long would it take for the US, Japan, and the EU, for example, to develop their own domestic processing refining capacity, especially for rare earths? And there's another question, so you do feel free to answer both or either one. Because of the time. The second question is, the US-Japan Critical Minerals Agreement and other bilateral agreements like it contain no binding language There's a lot of may, shall endeavor, and to the extent possible. What practical implications do they have for actual cooperation? Tatsushi, do you want to take that one as it's got a Japan angle?
The Japan's angle is that probably it is very difficult for Japan to establish its own the processing industry because with respect to some the materials such as copper, the Japan still has the second largest the refining capacity of the copper, but the probably other materials, the Japan is no longer so competitive in the processing industry. Therefore, my understanding is that the Japanese company is trying to work with other Asia Pacific the partners to create the refining and the processing hub in the region. That's their strategy, but it is probably long and winding road, and they are still struggling with the cost issues and the regulatory issues. Therefore, it will not be realized in the short term. That's my observation.
Hitoshi or Kristin, did you want to, either of you want to come in on that? Chris's questions. Kristin.
In terms of developing purely within that zone supply chains, I would say target date, if it's an all-in effort, would be 2035.
Okay. Precise date. And Hitoshi.
Yes, I think Japan has long been sort of comfortable to admit that it has almost no sort of resources on its own. And so I think Japan's efforts has always been to collaborate with other countries. So in this case, I would not be so much optimistic on Japan's own self-sufficiency, but then we would like to sort of collaborate in that sense with the United States, Australia, Canada, and those like-minded countries. And if that was price competitive in terms of China sourced or anything else, that would be very much welcome, not only by the car industry, but almost every industry in Japan. So I think that would be, yeah, my point, yeah.
And last couple of questions now, just for everybody's information. I've got one about Indonesia specifically from Devi Fortuna Anwar, who's from the National Research and Innovation Agency, Indonesia, BRIN. If demands for EVs are going down, how do panelists see the prospect for Indonesia's nickel processing in coming years? Tatsushi, yeah.
The overcapacity of the nickel production in Indonesia has already created the big problem in the nickels market, and therefore they will continue to struggle. But at the end of the day, many experts forecast that the nickel demand will increase, and therefore that's the business of the critical minerals. That you have to accept this downturn period, and yes, that is the business of the critical minerals.
Yeah. Thank you, Tatsushi. And the last questions, because we got a couple that are sort of bunched together. One from Jeffrey Bean about other mechanisms that may enable greater processing capacity outside China for Quad countries for critical minerals that will come in online in the near future. And then there's a question from Nehal Mishra again on Australia's growing focus on downstream processing of critical materials. How long do you think it may take for Australia to match or even outpace China's capacity in this area? Is it a global solution for global supply chain resilience? So perhaps this will be the final set of questions. So Tatsushi, did you want to have a go at that?
Yes. To be honest with you, in the past, Australia's biggest client was China, And Australia's the export of the lithium, for example, they sold the majority of the lithium to China, and the many of the critical minerals that went to the Chinese market. Therefore, even if the Australia is successfully establishing its processing industry, the next question is who will purchase the materials at the end of the day, and it might be China, and that is the question how we are able to discuss and sort out.
Thank you. Hitoshi?
Yes. So just as I said, Japan expects so much on like-minded countries, and Australia almost at the top of the list. And how long would that take? I think, yeah, Tatsushi-san would know more than I would, but the sooner the better would be the answer. And Australia has just lost its own car industry because everyone has just retreated and closed down factories. But then now it's not just digging the ground. Now it has to be refining, and that requires sort of technology. So I think there's sort of a shift of the industry, and Australia has lots of chances there. And I expect the Japanese industry and financing is sort of happy to find such collaboration, and especially because it's the economic security, the Japanese government will also be happy to see such collaborations. Yeah.
Thank you. And Kristin?
I think when we think about these things, we can think about like this moment and building cooperative frameworks for countries to work together, as well as the correct way to finance things to ease initial risks and price fluctuations and those sorts of market risks and political risks. But we also need to think about the long term, which means building a really strong pipeline, a foundation for the technology and for the expertise to build out diverse and resilient supply chains that can meet the demand of the growing green technology sector. And that means investing in research, basic research and development, building expertise, and in investing in that basic core foundational things that will serve us 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road.
Thank you. I'm afraid I've been a bad chair and we're now 2 minutes over the hour, so apologies for that. But I do have to bring this discussion to a close now, and apologies to those of you who asked questions and I didn't get time to get to your questions. Do apologize for that. 3 things stuck out for me from the discussion. One, that Hitoshi, you mentioned that we now need China-specific supply chains, US-specific supply chains, and rest of world specific supply chains. That's a sort of quite a new world for businesses and governments to operate in. Tatsushi, you were talking about the changing nature of financing for critical minerals and so on. And this is obviously for multilateral organizations and organizations such as yours, this is quite a new world, and you're also having to operate in a geopolitically more fragmented world as well. Kristin, you were talking, come back to the point I made at the beginning, highlighting what you said at the beginning, which is about choke points being the result of policy and the need to have goals for critical minerals and other policies, which sounds so easy and so obvious, but obviously it's not as obvious as it sounds. But so thank you, Tatsushi, Kristin, and Hitoshi for this fantastic discussion, really rich discussion on a day, the day after the president's tariff announcements. I think you pulled everything together beautifully, and I thought that I'm sure our audience will take away some good insights from what you said, and hopefully they'll be actionable for the audience as well. Just for the audience, the recording of this webinar will be available on the IISS website within the next day or so, I think. So we hope you will be able to look at that and read the transcript and sort of cogitate on what was said, and that you'll also be able to join us for the next IISS Japan Chair Programme webinar in the near future. So a virtual round of applause for our guests. So many thanks again. Thank you, audience, as well, and see you soon. See you next time. Goodbye.